Welcome back to the Evolve Sales Leader Podcast, recorded live right here on LinkedIn every Friday. I'm Jonathan Fisher. As business development leaders, it can be frustrating when results don't meet expectations. And sometimes it just feels like things are out of balance somehow. Well, today's guest will heartily agree that the issue of balance is critical to success in B2B selling. Michael Hanson is a real estate serial entrepreneur. I'm sorry, not real estate. Michael Hanson is a serial entrepreneur, having founded several successful companies, including the B2B sales consulting firm Growth Genie, where he is the CEO. And on our show today, Michael will be speaking on the yin and yang of sales. This is understanding the opposites to achieve balance in sales. Before our conversation is through, you will have several key insights that you can use to have buyers wanting to hear from you, taking your phone calls, reading your direct messages, replying to your emails. You're going to have ways to make prospects excited to show up to your meetings. You can build an unbreakable connection with your buyer and create conditions where prospects actually want to buy from you. And of course, before we're through today, you're going to walk away with an actionable framework that you can use to implement everything we cover. Michael Hanson, fantastic to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invite and looking forward to today's conversation.
So let's kick it right off. So how did you come to this insight that there is something called that you could call the yin and yang in sales? Maybe tell us how you arrived at the insight, and then what does that even mean?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll talk about an example of what I see go wrong with salespeople, right? So I'm going to talk about this as a buyer, and then also as someone as like a sales trainer who's listened to salespeople's calls. So if we take a first scheduled call, so not talking about outbound here, we're talking about you booked a meeting with someone and you want to learn more about a product. What I see happen is two things which are like polarized, right? And it's like everything else. We live in this digital age where there's lots of polarization if you look in the media or anything else. Now, sales is no different from what I've seen, right? You got one camp who's like, let's do a discovery call. And we're just going to ask the person loads of questions and get to know them. But it's like a little bit of an interrogation. It's like, why are you asking me all these questions? I just want to see your product. And then on the other side, you got someone who's like, I'm just going to talk about our products and talk about ourselves. Whereas what I think you should be doing is a bit of both, right? So you should be asking questions to understand the buyer so that you can tailor your solution, but still show them something because they've booked 30 minutes with you to learn about your product. So it's doing a bit of both. And something I like to think about, and this is one of the principles of the yin and yang of sales, is in every call, the buyer should learn something new from you and you should learn something new from them. So that's one of the principles in yin and yang of sales is educate and learn. And then in terms of where it comes from, the concept of yin and yang, a lot of people would have seen it on like necklaces and like hippie markets and stuff. But essentially it's from a religion called Taoism, which is 2,000 years old. So it's as old as Christianity. And it's all about everything has an opposite, right? And these opposites are actually interconnected. And if you can find the balance between the opposites, that's where you have success and like transcendent. So I think in sales, we always need to have this balance. And like, that's just one thing I talked about there. You should be educating, but you should also be learning from your buyer as well.
So what is the normal approach right now? So you say there's these divergent approaches. Like what are some of the most common ways that you see sales teams missing it in B2B sales, especially as regards to this issue of balance?
Yeah, sure. So I gave that one example of like educate versus learn, but let's say another thing I talk about is like give versus take, right? So if you look at sales in a very basic way, it's give versus take in a sense that as salespeople, we're always trying to take things, right? So if you're an SDR, you're trying to take people's time. I want to have 15, 30 minutes with you. If you're closing deals, you're trying to take people's money. Or even like I was saying on a discovery call, you're trying to take information, but you're not thinking, what can I give this person in return? So, but you still need to know when to take as well. So if you've given a lot of things, don't be scared to ask for the sale, ask for the meeting. So you're balancing those two things together.
So the premise here is that either extreme can lead to less than optimum results is kind of what I'm hearing, Michael. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of the essence of the thing here is that if we can balance the give and the take, these other sort of antinomies we may have, that's where there's a sweet spot. Is that, am I on track?
Yeah, exactly. And even if you look at things like I see different types of sellers, right? You get more of like an old school seller who's like, let's just cold call, LinkedIn is useless, right? It's just for like young people. It's people wasting time. No one reads their emails. So let's just do $100 a day and just like cold call people, right? And then you've got other people who are like, oh, calling doesn't work anymore. Like no one picks up their phone, right? Whereas actually what I found is if you use all of these things together, you can research someone on LinkedIn, like nurture them. Imagine, people are listening to this for you. They've got some awareness of Jonathan Fisher of Overpass. If you give them a cold call, it's actually less of a cold call. It's warm, right? But the problem is, what I found in sales is you get people in like camps, right? They want to belong to a band. And even if you take this outside of sales, I see this now with like remote working, right? Like some people are really big into remote working. They're like, oh, if you make people work in an office, you're really backwards. And then you got other people who are like, oh, people who work from home do nothing. They're not productive. Whereas in reality, both sides have a bit of truth, right? Which is now you're seeing the rise of hybrid working as well.
Yeah, I'm a real fan of this way of thinking. I mean, it takes two wings for an airplane to fly straight, right? I don't know about you, but unless you have a condition, we use two legs to walk, right? And it's nice to have a right and right arms and hands. So there's definitely something to that there's a balancing act to be done here. So what is it about selling that makes it relate specifically to this yin and yang concept, though? If you could break that down even further for us.
Yeah, so it's essentially the Taoist philosophy, which is where yin and yang comes from, is like everything has that. So everything, there's like an action and a reaction, right? Like if you ask a question, you get an answer. If you're giving something to someone, they naturally want to give stuff back to you. So that's why it's relevant to sales, because everything has some type of balance, right? So when it comes to sales, it's exactly the same. You're always trying to think, what's that balance that I can be achieving? So some questions, like I said, you want to be thinking about, have I learned something new off this person? And have they also learned something new off me during a call? Because often it's one way or the other. Like I've just been teaching them about things, but they haven't been learning anything from me. So an example I'll give you is, I always say when I'm training SDRs, that your goal, your principal goal, first goal on the call is not to book a meeting. Because if you book a meeting with someone and you've learned nothing about them, you've got no idea if it's qualified, and it may be a total waste of time, right? Whereas your first goal is research. It's to understand if this person has a challenge that you can help with. And once you've uncovered that challenge, then you talk about your products, right? Then you give information about how you can help them solve that challenge, and then you book a meeting, right? So that's more of like a mindset thing, but that's an example. Okay, we're trying to take information to understand if this person's qualified, and once we've done that, then we're going to give them some information about our product.
So I really like that, and the reality is we go in, and I don't know about every single sales professional out there, but I think a lot of times you're almost thinking more in the straight line. There's even a system of training called straight line sales, and maybe it's less of a straight line. Sometimes it's better you kind of have to do a little bit of a different mental, I think, approach to think about. All right, is there this give and a take happening? You've got multiple sort of opposites in your training on yin and yang. So give and take is one of them. What are some of the ways we can know whether there's enough give and take? Can you give us some more examples? Like you mentioned, one of them was, am I learning versus teaching? Give us a couple others if you would.
Yeah, sure. So why don't I give you an example of like how we actually book a lot of outbound meetings at Growth Genie, right? So we never say, do you have 15 minutes to someone we don't know? Because we think that if we're contacting a stranger, the last thing they're going to want to give us is their time, right? But there's actually a study done by Gong that analyzed 500,000 emails, cold emails to strangers. And what they found is if you ask for interest, you get twice as many meetings as if you ask for time, right? So how do we put this into practice? And that psychologically, the reason for that is because you can be interested in many different things, but you only have 40 hours in a work week, even if you're a workaholic, 60 hours, right?
Yeah.
So if we break down this, I'm going to give you the approach. So there's 3 steps if I'm looking at like an email, which is your reason for getting in touch with the person, a pain point that they may have, and then something that can solve that pain point, which is, it could be a piece of content, right? So in our case, I may say, hey, Mr. VP of Sales, Jonathan, I noticed you're hiring SDRs at the moment. once you hire them, you want to get them to hit target as quickly as possible, which is actually taking longer than before because sales is becoming more difficult. Would you be interested in a playbook that can help you onboard your SDRs twice as quick? So here I'm not saying, would you like to learn more about sales training, sales consulting? I'm saying we've got a playbook that's going to help you onboard those new hires faster that you're about to hire, right? So I'm giving something away for free, and we get a very high response rate on that email. So that's an example of give. Now, the idea is they say yes. Now, once they've said yes, then I can engage them in a sales conversation, and then I can turn it into, because that's the other thing I see. Some people are really good at this research approach, but then they're not closing. They don't book the meeting. They don't go for the sale, right? So you still got to do both. Once you've got the interest, then that's when you want to turn it into a sales conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting how different personalities will definitely shine in different aspects of the sales piece. This research piece you're talking about, so giving good insights, and there's a rule of reciprocity at work you talked about, and being ready to close that sale once you've given something that attracts them to come to that meeting. So basically, they're not coming to the meeting to find out about your fancy widget. They're coming to the meeting to find out how you're going to solve a problem for them. You also talk about offering genuine value outside of the demo. I mean, if I've got you on my call to show you my widget, how can I offer you value besides my demo?
Yeah, so I'll give you some examples here. So we're getting a little bit more into like a salesperson who's trying to close a deal. They've had a conversation with someone, they've seen the product, and you're trying to nurture them through to close. You know, especially if you're selling like big enterprise, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollar deals, it's not going to be a one call close, right? So you're going to have several calls. Now, the mistake I see with a lot of salespeople is they'll just wait for the next online call or in-person meeting. And then what it feels like as a buyer is this is very transactional. We're only ever going to talk about business. We got no relationship outside of that. Whereas what I think is in between those calls, try and be helpful. So something I do, right? We're not a recruitment firm, right? But if I know that a VP of sales is hiring SDRs or hiring A's, I say, hey, send me the job post, and I'm part of loads of communities, and I can post that for you, or introduce them to something like Overpass, right? So I'm trying to help them, even though I don't get commission out of that. We're not a recruitment firm. We never get involved in the recruitment of SDRs. We just do the training. I'm just trying to be helpful. And I know they've got that problem of hiring, right? So that's what I'll do is I'll go out of my way to help them, even if it's not related to my service, right? Because again, when it comes to the next call, they're like, oh, Michael's helpful. Michael likes to help us. He's not just trying to sell us something. He's just a helpful person in general. So that's what you want to be as a salesperson. This comes to the balance of yin and yang, is try and be as seen as helpful as possible, right? And then people are going to trust you and they're going to buy from you.
I like this because it's an alternative to the old, I think it could be a little bit cheesy of trying to create personal conversation with folks. Now, if you're a natural at that and it can happen, that's great, but it can feel very forced when you get in a sales conversation. Someone's asked me how my day is going and I just met them. Honestly, it's off-putting. But if someone says, hey, I've got this other idea I can help, that does stand out. I think that's really powerful, Michael. Do you find that a lot of people you're working with in sales teams, do you feel awkward? Like, how do I build a human connection? And what advice do you give them? Maybe they don't have some of the additional assets and value to add that you have. What advice do you give an SDR to be positioned to do that?
Yeah, it's what you said is actually something that a lot of like SDRs, account executives say to me. They're like, oh, what do I do in between calls? You're saying like I can nurture, send them emails with helpful content. What kind of helpful content can I send them? And this is where I say the best sales teams don't work just as individuals. They'll work with teams. So like ask your customer success team, have you worked with a similar customer in the past and what were the pains they were facing? And then you can say, hey, your situation reminds me of this customer and this I think will be helpful to you. Speak to your marketing team, right? Use marketing to know like what's some useful content you can share, right? Like we're on a podcast webinar today. That may be something interesting for your sales team at Overpass to use to nurture leaders, right? So always just think around like content that you can share, just generally being helpful. And even if you see something in the news that maybe is relevant to them, send them that. It doesn't also just have to be content that your company is creating. It could be external third-party reports, guides. It could be anything.
That's good stuff. Well, speaking of SDRs looking for additional ways to add value, it's a good chance for us to remind our audience our show is powered by Overpass, one of the best platforms out there, if not the best, to quickly hire highly skilled SDRs, AEs, anybody in sales support, anybody that needs to work a phone or work an email account or work social media for your business, especially in business development. Some of the best people literally on the planet are waiting with their hands raised to work for a great company like yours. All you got to do is go create a free account at overpass.com if you're the hiring manager, and you can have people that are fantastic hired to work for you in days instead of weeks. Check it out, overpass.com. So this idea of offering additional value outside of the demo, you also speak about just generally communicating. Does it follow the same vein, or do you see there are ways to kind of connect a little bit beyond that demo call? Are there some maybe tactical and strategic things you should be looking to do outside of a given demo call to help your close rate improve?
Yes, you should also think about an account-based sales approach, right? Because when you're on a call, the person may say to you, hey, I need to speak to my boss about this. I need to speak with someone else in the company, or I'm not the right person. So what you can do is you can take the information you've learned in that and then connect with the other stakeholders, right? And say, hey, I had an interesting conversation with Jonathan. Here's what we talked about. He mentioned these are pains. Is there any other pains that you have that you wanted to mention, right? Or would you like to join us on our next call? So that's one thing, engaging different stakeholders. Again, there's two sides of this. There's account-based selling of who are the different stakeholders at the account I'm selling to. And then on the other side, you've got your own team. Think about who else from your team can you involve. Maybe you're talking to a CEO, right? So you bring in your CEO and they have like a CEO type strategy session. Or maybe you sell to chief marketing officers. So you bring in your CMO, right? And they kind of get together and talk about marketing. So always think around the stakeholders, both on the buying side and the selling side, and how you can use them.
Yeah, I love that. Well, something else I've heard you share, Michael, is that at its heart, and who would disagree, sales is about communication. And so if we're talking about balance in communication, how does that apply to selling conversations?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Balance and communication.
Yeah, if sales is primarily communicating, is that another area where yin and yang is something we could apply? Like, is there an imbalance in the communication that's happening as we're out there selling B2B?
Yeah, I think pretty much everything we talked about today is communication. Like, I think to me, sales is the art of communication, right? But I can give you another maybe like yin and yang part of our module on the yin and yang of sales is we call it material and spiritual. The word spiritual freaks people out. So you can even talk about it as emotional, right? So if I break this down, let's think about if you're a VP of sales, chief sales officer, chief revenue officer, often those personas are always thought about as, the only thing they're interested in is I need my team to hit my target and I need to hit the numbers, right? Now, yes, of course, that's true. And that is what we would call the material side of it, right? The metrics. Behind that as well, the spiritual side is what I found. I've spoken to hundreds of these sales leaders over the years, is they're also interested in the development of their team. So seeing like their SDRs, their AEs become managers, right? Becoming future leaders, becoming better humans. And that's more of a spiritual side that really feeds their spirit, thinking, I've helped this team, I've helped this individual like rise through the ranks. I've really helped them in their career. And I find that all sales leaders are generally like that. So that's an idea of, you're selling at a material level. You're telling this person, yes, we're going to make you ROI. We're going to help you hit your target. But then you're also talking about how you're going to help their team individually as well. So that's more of like a spiritual thing. And pretty much every buyer, even if you look at a CFO, who are the ones who you really think, they're only interested in numbers. CFOs are humans. They're like us, right? They go to the pub. Some of them go to like Burning Man. I've met CFOs that go to Burning Man, So like everyone has that human side as well. So people aren't just numbers, and you've got to connect with them on a human and emotional level as well.
And I guess in a way that brings us back to that we do want to make a human connection as much as possible. That's more difficult early on. It can't be forced. But Once you're in conversation, it sounds like it makes sense to start to ask some questions about that person. Do you have a recommendation as to the kinds of questions you can ask? What are some things that, like, is there a matrix you can follow? What advice do you give in your training to SDRs and other sales development leaders?
So you mean questions related on more of like an emotional level, or?
Yeah. How can I discern so the material is going to be more clear. I can usually calculate that from the discovery call, as most people would refer to it. However, the spiritual can be far more difficult to discern, depending on maybe if it's all in their LinkedIn profile, it may not be. It depends on the individual, right? Lots of times that stuff's not there. What do you do to discern that?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example here, right? Often it's about going more specific, because often I see like salespeople put pains at a very base, like what I call surface level, and they need to go deeper. And then you're like, okay, how can I go deeper in this in a material level? How can I go deeper on a spiritual level? Now, to give you an example, a base level pain could be cold calling is difficult, right? It's very base level. But if you go deeper on a material and a spiritual level, you could say, the average connect rate now for a cold call is 5%. That means 1 in 20 people pick up, and it can be soul destroying as a salesperson to not get any connects all day. So you've got the statistic, 1 in 20 people pick up, and then you've got the emotion, it's soul destroying for your sales team. So rather than just saying cold calling is difficult, that's an example of how you can make that, more material and more spiritual. Well, I can't hear you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Are people occasionally reticent to share what are some of what you're calling the spiritual aspects of an ROI? Could that be difficult to tease out? Is that something that, when you're building the playbook, do you kind of have some additional questions in there in discovery that can help you discern that?
Yeah, we always, like, if we're doing like interviewing our clients, for example, we say to them, like, what are some of the emotional things, like the emotional pains, emotional goals of your buyers, right? We're going to look into that. So say it's we've got fintech companies you're working with, like financial technology, and some of them have like basic technology where you can scan receipts, right, on your phone, so you don't have to like actually use a scanner and then upload it to your computer. So it's essentially taking away a lot of time that would be done on quite boring admin work. And then it's like, hey, you can spend more time with your family, and you don't have to like work on the weekends and like at night, like doing this type of stuff. So that's an example of it. But yeah, always think around. And the other advice I would give to any salespeople that are listening to this is become experts in your industry, right? So obviously I sell to sales leaders and marketing leaders, and I understand their brain, and that's why I can come on this podcast and talk about this. But if you sell to finance leaders, right, you should be listening to podcasts about CFOs. You should be reading like CFO reports. And once you get into that world, then you're going to start understanding what are their like emotional goals, what are their material goals. So that's something I would always say. You're actually going to be a better salesperson if you understand the customers and their problems that you sell to more than your product and its features.
Well, so it sounds like if you're savvy, you can come into the conversation already aware, and hopefully you've workshopped with your team. What are some of those more affective, emotional components of a return on an investment? Where are the real pain points you're going to solve? All that pain isn't more emotional, therefore the results will be emotional as well. I like that balance. Now you call that spiritual or purpose related versus material or the money related. What else can we do to discern some of the more, the less monetarily oriented ROI factors? Are like, I'll give you an example. What's popping to my mind, like, what about the person's career? Is that making it overly personal? Can you overdo that side? How can you do it wrong, I guess, would be a good question to ask you.
Yeah, you've always, and that's why I said at the start, you got to be careful with these things, because even the word spiritual like freaks people out, right? Some people don't like the word spiritual. So like you said, I break it down by like purpose, right? What's the purpose to all of this? So it could be the impact they have. Another thing I like to think about is impact, right? And I've always actually said that in sales, you should focus on how are you positively impacting people, because if you're positively impacting an organization, they're going to give you as much money as you want. So actually the two things are very interconnected. But yeah, of course, like the term spiritual and is often associated with like hippies in California, etc. So I'm more talking about here, what's the higher purpose of working together? How are we both going to help reach our goals, and not just, hey, let's make loads of money together, but how are we going to help society? How are we as a team going to help each other? And I think the example I gave earlier, so I gave you an example of like a chief revenue officer. It's not just they're going to hit their target, they're going to see their team develop and see all their salespeople be happy. I'll give you another example with marketing. Marketing's complaint is always sales treats us like shit. Sales doesn't care about our content, blah, blah, blah. It's not always the case, right? But often we see that between marketing and sales. So if you could say, we're going to help your marketing team be more appreciated, have better visibility with the sales team, again, that's a bit of like a spiritual thing, because then marketing's seen as having a higher purpose within the company.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Another yin yang balance that you've talked about in your training is current challenges versus future results when you're discussing return on investment or discussing your solution. Share more about that with us, if you would.
Yeah, so the example I give here, and I'm going to come to, I always like talking the analogy of the film The Lion King, right? Because it's a film that most people have seen, like one of the most famous films ever. And in that, you have Scar, who is the villain, right? Who is the evil uncle. And then you have Simba, who's like the hero of the film. Now, what I say is, without Scar, there would be no Lion King, right? It wouldn't be a famous film, because Scar creates all the drama in the film, and that Simba thinks he killed his dad because that's what Scar made him think. So he leaves Pride Land, and he ends up coming back to Pride Land to defeat Scar and like save the kingdom. Now, the reason I give that story is that basically in every story, you need a villain, right? You need some type of challenge that you're trying to overcome. And in your customer stories, it's the same. So the big problem I see is, again, if we go to a customer story, we made this company 5 times ROI. We made them $5 million, $100 million, whatever it is. And it's like, so what? Because you don't know what was the situation before working with you. So you always need that pain of what was the situation before working, what was the scar in your story. And I can go into chats about psychology and all kinds of stuff here, but Carl Jung calls this like the shadow, right? Which is like, what's the shadow that you're trying to overcome? So always think about that in your stories, is like, who is your villain? Who is your Scar from The Lion King? And many people here, I'm sure, will have seen The Lion King, but even if The Lion King is not a film, your favorite film, think about your favorite film. And I imagine there may be a happy ending, but there was loads of drama at the start. And if that drama didn't exist, the ending would be irrelevant. So you've always got to think around, what's that villain in your story? I can't hear you, Jonathan.
That's a great way to frame it. And I like how looking at the challenge as a villain can also unify you in a common mission with your buyer.
Exactly.
So a lot of great insights, and I know you've got a lot more to share on this whole concept of yin and yang. Michael, you've got an initiative that's helping you get your message out there a little bit more. How can folks take the conversation further from today?
Yeah, so I was going to suggest everyone listens to a podcast that I just started a couple of months ago called The Cosmic Bridge. And essentially, it's related to one of these concepts of, we're talking about yin and yang, which is connecting the material and the spiritual. So what I found with working with sales leaders, who we're often seen as very material people because we're trying to help people get money and our company's money, but often they have a story behind them, a spiritual side. And that's what we talk about in the Cosmic Bridge, things that connect people's material world and spiritual world and profession and their passion. So yeah, recommend listening to that. And we actually have quite a lot of sales leaders who've come on, like Dale Dupree, John Barrows, but they're talking about their family life and their spiritual life. So it's quite interesting.
Good stuff. Well, I think that sounds like a worthy addition to your listening pleasure, along with, of course, the Evolve Sales Leader. And we're fellow travelers, it sounds like, Michael. Well, let's jump in, audience, to our live Q&A. We've got some questions folks have been posting in chat. Let's go ahead and take a look and see how we can interact with our live audience right now. So let's see here. So LinkedIn user makes this comment. I think there's a good question kind of tucked in with it. Detachment from a specific outcome, but at the same time, nurturing and being helpful. That sounds like a little bit of a riff off of the whole Taoist origins of your concept here. Would you agree with that and expound on that, please?
Yeah, 100%. And this I like this comment here because it's really a good example of how you can go too far in either direction. Because I've done this in training, especially with like young SDRs, and I'm like, detach from the outcome, right? Going with the mindset, I just want to learn from this person. But sometimes if you detach too much, then it's like, oh, I'm just never going to book the meeting, right? So it's about having that. My goal here is not to book a meeting. My goal is to get another person to know the challenges of the buyer. But then if the buyer's telling you loads of challenges and then you just hang up the phone, you're like, the meeting was there to be booked, right? So it's definitely that balance of I'm going to fall in love with the process, right? But if at the end of the day, you still need to get the results as well.
Yeah. You can't be too detached because there might be that one more push that person needs. And, I always like seeing the one with the most passion wins is one of my mentors taught me. And if I'm passionate about them receiving the help and the great benefit that my product or service can provide them, then I'm going to want to push beyond that little resistance. I want to send that extra email, make that extra phone call, make that extra effort to help them get what benefits them. So here's a question for you as well. Let's see here. It was right here from Lindy. Here we go. Yeah, Lindy asked a good question. How much time should an SDR spend researching before reaching out, and what are some of the things they should be looking for in their research piece?
Yes, this is a great question. This is actually another one of the yin and yangs, which is quality versus quantity. So sales is a numbers game, right? Because the majority of people you reach out to are not going to be a good fit for your service, right? It's not going to be the right time. They're not the right person, etc. So you need to reach a large number of people, but you don't want to spam people, right? So I normally say don't spend more than 5 or 10 minutes like researching a lead, because if you do that, you're not going to be able to reach a large number of people in a day. So what I recommend doing is think about what are some research triggers that you're looking for that make a good company a fit for your service. So I say, for example, in our business, if a company's hiring salespeople, I know that they're a good fit because we can help with the training. If they're using a piece of sales technology. So when I'm looking at a company website or LinkedIn, I'm quickly trying to scan that information and I can do that in 5 minutes. So you should think about what are those triggers for your companies as well.
Yeah, that's good stuff. What about some tips or best practices for mindset for SDRs, asks Chris here on LinkedIn. Are there some, I guess maybe a priori or even during the call, like what is your advice in terms of mindset?
Yeah, so I think the last comment touching it, like detachment is a good one. So if you're feeling like really scared, which is normal, especially for cold calling, oh my God, I don't know if the person's going to be rude to me, if I'm going to book the meeting, just detach and say, hey, I'm just going to have a conversation with this person. If they're a good fit, that's great, I'll book the meeting. If not, no worries, I'll move on to the next one. That's one thing. And then the other thing I like to think of is this concept of voluntary suffering, right? Which is actually the things that are the hardest are often the most rewarding. So things like cold calling, for example, is more difficult than sending someone an email, because when you send someone an email, you don't have to see their reaction. You don't have to feel their emotion. But the reason cold calling is difficult is because if you get someone on the phone and you have a conversation with them, more magic can happen. So I say, like, put yourself in tough situations, and that's how you're going to grow as a salesperson.
Love it. Dennis asked a great question here. The idea of communication styles and giving and taking and offering value to both sides. How do you track that's happening to your organization as a leader?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I mean, another one is like speaking versus listening, right? So there's different technology tools you can use, like Gong, Chorus, and Lego, and they will break down the percentage that the prospect is speaking and the percentage that the seller and the buyer are speaking. So obviously if it's a two-way call, that should be about 50-50. And then if you're looking at the if the buyer's actually speaking 90% of the time, that may not be a good thing because maybe the seller hasn't taken control. And obviously the other side of it, if the seller's speaking all the time, that's not good because they're just kind of product pitching. So you're looking at like, should be a 60-40 split either way.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's another great question from Lindy, and I think my mind is thinking in terms of enablement with her question. She says it's great to have other departments working with sales to help, offer value. Are there maybe do you have sort of an ideal suite of assets that enablement people could offer or marketing people could offer their sales colleagues to help support this idea of offering value?
Yeah, the thing I always say is create snippets, right? So, sorry to all the marketing teams out there, but when you create long form content, your sales team doesn't read it most of the time, and they can't, because if you're a big organization, you create loads of content. You got like this hour podcast every week, an hour webinar, a like 5,000 page guide. So what you want to do is create snippets of like, these are the best bits from this. These are 2 or 3 statistics that are really interesting. Sales team can scan it and say, oh, that's relevant for my buyer. So always try and create snippets, or what I call like trailers to your content.
So is obviously a long form may have its place, but if I'm hearing you correctly, maybe break that down so that you have a usable item the sales operators can use by way of posting social or connect, attaching to email or what have you. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, exactly.
That's good. Well, hey, you're getting more bang for your buck, so no apology to marketing required, right? They're getting more for the same effort. Joshua actually asked an interesting question from a recent post on your social there on LinkedIn. What was the last scary but rewarding task that you tackled? Personal question for you, I gather.
Yeah, well, I might actually go to today. So even though we do sales training, as I'm like busy kind of running my company, I don't have as much time to do things like cold calling as I used to, but I still like to do it because we do cold call training. So I would feel like a hypocrite if I don't still cold call, as it's changing all the time. And today I did cold calling for the first time in a while. We're using this thing called a parallel dialer, which essentially calls like loads of numbers at once because of the problem I mentioned earlier, that people don't pick up their phone anymore. So I was like having random people pick up the phone, and then it kind of comes in your face very quickly. Hey, this is the persona, this is the industry. So that was a bit intimidating, but again, I had about 6 conversations, and nice. As I had more conversations, it got easier. So yeah, that was a scary but rewarding task.
So, I mean, you flat out admitted on LinkedIn that cold calling scares you. To your credit, I admire you for admitting that out loud. You're certainly not unique in that regard, right?
I think cold calling scares everyone. I think even like the top sales trainer, cold caller in the world, if they said cold calling that very first instance till you get that first connect didn't scare them, they would be lying, because you can't. The problem with cold calling is you can only control what you say. You can never control the other person and what they're going to do. Whereas if you write an email, you can control every little bit that's in that email. You don't see how the person responds to it. So that's why calling is scary. And again, it's a bit like going out onto when people are scared of public speaking because they don't know how people are going to react to them. But what they can control is what they say, right? So it's the same with cold calling. Just focus on yourself and what you're talking about, and you just have to let the other people be them.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Someone on LinkedIn says it's like improv comedy. I like that. Maybe I'm the weirdo, but I don't find cold calling scary anymore. I used to. For me, a lot of what you're talking about, I think maybe I've also internalized, and that is I'm there to offer value. So if I'm calling you, maybe I'll bother you for a second, but you're not going to care in a minute. You're going to be glad I bothered you. If you can let me speak to you what I'm about to say, you're going to be glad I bothered you. Like, have you ever been bothered by somebody at first, but then it ends up being really great? I assume that that's the outcome I'm trying to create for the person I'm cold calling, and it makes it fun. It is a bit of a game. It is like improv comedy. Have some fun. I mean, what right now you got nothing, right? Before you're calling them, so you have literally nothing to lose there for. So that should be really good, ammo for all of those in the SDR rule. Hey, you do still have to make some what we might still call cold calls. They do not yet know you. You are ringing their phone. Whatever else you've done to reach out, a lot of new methodologies we've trained on with that, a lot of which is having those snippets to offer and taking some other steps, doing some research. So it's not completely a cold call. Still, there's going to be some need for that, though. Would you agree with that, by the way?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story related to what you're saying is I cold called someone and they ended up becoming a customer. And they said to me, they were like, I remember you calling me and I was like giving you information. I was like, why am I giving this person information? I'm giving them too much information. Like, it needs to stop. Anyway, this person, she's a chief marketing officer. She actually ended up becoming my friend. They've been a customer for 2 years and she invited me to her wedding, right? So that's how much
nice.
cold calling can work, that I'm like, you can build like really meaningful relationships. And as I said, not just transactional, where you build trust and you end up becoming friends with people. So that was a nice story about cold calling.
Yeah. Well, when you've got chutzpah, but you're also authentic, I think people are attracted to that, right? Like, here's a real human being who actually is pushing themselves out here. That's impressive to people. So again, there's a lot to be said when you come at it with the right mindset and the right heart. It is kind of a hard thing. And again, back to that balancing, right? I have a monetary impact I want to achieve, but I'm not really focused on that when I'm cold calling. I'm focusing on the fact that I want to benefit this other human I'm going to talk to, and it can only go either well or zero, right? So why not?
Yeah.
Another good question from Joshua here. How can an SDR, and this is really more of a tactical question. So like, let's say it's me. Let's say we're sitting in that chair again. I'm making some calls. How do I know if my conversation is in balance or not? Are there some just easy, simple ways I can measure that?
Yeah, 100%. So first one is that question I said at the start. Once you finish the call, think back and think, did I learn something off this person? Because if you had a 3-minute conversation, you didn't learn anything new about them, then the call was kind of a waste of time from your perspective. And think, did they learn something new from you? If they didn't, then it was a waste of time from their perspective. Think about, was I speaking too much on that call? Like, was I listening to the other person? Right. So that's another thing. And then also thinking around, did I connect with this person on like a human level, right? Did I connect with them in that way? Or did I just talk about like numbers and figures, right? So those are some questions to ask yourself.
I love it. Should it literally be as close to 50-50 percentage-wise in terms of verbiage as well? If I listen back to a Gong recording, let's say?
Yeah, 50-50 is good. It doesn't have to be that. If it's like 60-40, you speaking 60% of the time, that's also okay. I think the main thing is just that it's there's also a thing on a Gong recording that says interactivity, which I really like, which is like the back and forth that you're having as well. That's normally a good sign.
Good deal. Hey, final question of our session today. So again, from Chris, any insight on calls that go to voicemail or text, no voicemail? You know, what do you recommend when you're trying to get through, but you have a little way you can still communicate using technology?
Yeah, so voicemails, I still recommend leaving voicemails. What I normally do is I actually pair them with like an email or LinkedIn message. So I'd say, hey, Jonathan, been listening to your show every Friday. Really like it. I've actually got some tips around how you can reach more people and more sales leaders. I'm going to send you an email now. This is a subject line. And that kind of creates curiosity about the email. So that's normally a little formula I use for voicemail.
I love it. Good stuff. Well, I don't know if there's been a give or take. You've definitely given, and we're grateful for that today, Michael. Thanks so much for helping us all become more evolved sales leaders today.
Thanks a lot. No, I really enjoyed it.
And thanks to our listener. Without you, the show's not possible. Hey, keep on coming back and bring your friends next time. That's going to do it for this episode. Thanks so much again. Signing off. Take care, everybody.